In today's episode, I bring back Chief Science Officer and founder of C60 Purple Power, Ken Swartz. Ken shares with us how this incredibly powerful, naturally occurring molecule may help those dealing with mental health conditions such as anxiety and depression, as well as support individuals in recovering from trauma. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Inspire Health podcast as we continue on with our series on trauma recovery from surviving to thriving. And I'm super excited to bring back Ken Swartz with us today. And Ken is the Chief Science Officer and founder of C60 Purple Power. And you've probably heard me talking about this over the last several episodes. And it's something that I've incorporated into my own life probably for the last 4.5 months or so. And also several of my patients that have been using it. So I really wanted to bring Ken in and explain how C60 can play a role specifically with mood regulation, stress response. As you know, as we're doing this series on trauma, a lot of the sequelae to trauma are things like chronic anxiety and depression and mood dysregulation. And what's come up several times is the importance of getting back into the body. So when we think about mental health in a lot of ways, a lot of times we think that's all just up here in the head. And it's not that there's not a part that's up there, but what we're realizing is that it's a basically like a systems approach to health when we want to start to regulate how we're feeling. And if we've been caught in cycles of trauma and depression and anxiety for long periods of time, we need to look at it from many different perspectives. And one of the things that I really appreciate about C60 is it works at some of the really root levels in the physiology and the biochemistry that can really start to give people some momentum to start to feel better and better. So Ken, thanks so much for joining us again and welcome to the show.
Well, glad to be on.
Always nice to have you on here. And maybe what we can do at the beginning is for people that aren't as familiar with C60, can you give us a little bit of an overview of it and some of the general health benefits that people can appreciate with C60? And then we're going to dive more specifically into some of the mechanisms that play into mental health and how that can be supportive.
C60 is a carbon molecule shaped like a little, basically like of 60 atoms, 60 carbon atoms shaped like a little soccer ball. And it was actually discovered in 1985. And the people that discovered it received a Nobel Prize in 1996 in astronomy, because that's actually a molecule in between the stars, right? That's kind of how it was discovered. And then when they took it in the early 2000s to do testing for toxicity, because it's a new molecule from outer space, they discovered it doubled the lifespan of test animals. And part of that is it appears that C60 might have had something to do with the origin of life on Earth. And it's a whole nother subject that would take an entire show in and of itself. But since that time, they've done lots and lots of testing of C60, dissolved C60. It has to be dissolved in like an oil, or in some cases, they do it polyhydroxynated. And that's basically put a bunch of OHs on it. And you can use that as an injectable form. We do the one dissolved in oil. And it's just amazing. It's a super antioxidant, but it's a selective antioxidant. So it gets rid of oxidative radicals like superoxygen. That's an oxygen with an extra electron. The hydroxyl radical, that's like a water basically missing one of its hydrogens, so it's got an extra electron. Those electrons like to go off and do damage. And also peroxynitrite. But it doesn't interfere with things like nitrogen oxide. And there's also other radical oxidative species, which your body actually uses as signaling molecules. And they're usually based on sulfur, zinc, or iron, and C60 doesn't interfere with that. So and they've done tests where they gave C60 to animals like 1 gram per kilogram, which is 10,000 times what a person might be taking, and it had no toxic effects because it's a selective antioxidant. So it's incredibly safe. So you don't have to worry about that, because a lot of antioxidants, if you took too much of them, it has a negative effect because it interferes with those signaling molecules. And C60 doesn't interfere with the signaling molecules. And that's part of, it's actually probably the original antioxidants of life. And that's why it doesn't interfere with signaling molecules, because they were designed around C60 back in the day, billions of years ago. But these days, it has to be manufactured in a lab, and we get the highest purity, 99.99%, and we get it sublimated, which is like evaporated, and it's made basically in the lab the same way it's made between the stars.
Nice. Until we can actually get it directly from the stars. So
Yeah, exactly.
maybe one day.
Yes, exactly.
Before we dive into mental health, what are some of the other benefits that C60 has been related to?
Well, it fights inflammation, and it supports immunity, and it really increases mental clarity and energy, which I think you've experienced. And so, and it just, but it's key. One of its key things is mitochondria efficiency, increasing mitochondria efficiency, and we'll probably go more into that. But that's because it's an SOD mimic, that superoxide dismutase, which deals with superoxygen, which is one of the main kind of oxidative radical waste products that the mitochondria make, because they're the little furnaces which make ATP and all the energy for your cell. And so since C60 goes in there and replaces any missing SOD, then you can have like full functionality of your mitochondria.
Hmm. Well, and mitochondrial dysfunction is such a huge thing. It's really brought a lot of light to that. I would say over the last decade, and particularly over this last 5 years, I think it's become a really big topic, and people are always looking at ways to try and intervene to implement something that's going to upregulate mitochondrial function. I was just having a conversation with a colleague of mine that we're going to be working on a course together, and she focuses very much on autism, and right in the talk that she does to doctors teaching them how to work with autism, right at the very top of that is mitochondrial dysfunction, because if you cannot get your mitochondria to work, then you cannot produce adequate amounts of ATP, and that basically is going to have system-wide problems throughout everything. So it's one of the things that I like about treatments like this. So two things that I really like about C60 as well are, like you said, that it doesn't really interfere like sometimes other antioxidants do, because sometimes you're wanting to add in antioxidants and support certain pathways, but when you do that, they also play into other biochemical pathways, and so sometimes when you're putting certain things in, you might be supporting this, but it might be too much for this pathway over here. And so when you put in something like C60, I kind of feel like you can just put it in, and it has this way of just basically modulating whatever needs to be modulated without kind of upregulating too far or downregulating, where sometimes I feel like we can micromanage pathways when we start to add in very targeted nutrients. Sometimes it can feel like that. So I like that there's a certain safety profile. You don't have to worry too much about C60 in that regard. And then
Yeah.
the other thing is that it works at some of those founding levels. So when you're talking about mitochondrial function, let's jump in then to some of the big systems that are supported by C60 that specifically relate to mental health.
Okay. Well, first off, if you look at your nerve cells, in the nerve cells you have you have the main nerve cell, but you have the axons and the synapses, and there are literally hundreds of mitochondria in your nerve cells, and they've got to produce lots of ATP because, well, because they have to, not only do you have to, your neurotransmitters are made, takes a lot of energy to build those, then they've got to be transported, and then they're released and uptaken, and that takes ATP every time, in and out, in and out. And if you don't have sufficient ATP in your body, in your cells, you really just can't think correctly. Things will not work. And I mean, basically, your brain is what, 3 pounds or something, and it uses 20%
Mhm.
of the energy in your body. So it actually has more mitochondria than even your muscle cells. And because it's just such an energy using thing. And that's really important. Also, C60 protects against the oxidative radicals. Besides that, that's one of the reasons why sleep is so important, because there's no way that your body can really reprocess used up proteins and neurotransmitters, and your brain needs to dump those during sleep so that they can be taken out and processed in other centers of your body so it's ready for the next day. And that's another thing, and that, good sleep is so important, that for mental health. If you don't have that, that's another problem. And I want to say C60 doesn't fix anything, doesn't heal anything. What C60 does is lifts the oxidative burden your cells are under so that they can do proper cellular metabolism, and that brings you into health.
Mhm. I know I've got a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I remember when my first child was born, because they're also very close. My other one turns 4 pretty soon, and I know from taking C60 over the last while, the degree of sort of energy that's come up, the mental clarity that's even, and I was in I would say like really good health to begin with. So it's nice to sort of get a baseline and then see what else adds on when you've been doing anything for a regular period of time. And I was saying to my wife a while back, I was like, man, I wish that I was taking this back when we first had our kids, when our sleep was just horrible for those. I mean, I sort of, there's probably about 2 years of just really poor sleep because your kids are up back and forth and I definitely would find like a shift in my mitochondrial function just because of that poor sleep. And I mean, that's a ubiquitous problem. A lot of people have trouble sleeping. So anything that helps to sort of mitigate those things, I find, because when we talk about something like mood regulation, right? Like all of these factors play into it. It's like the same as when you look at something like blood sugar. If you're not modulating blood sugar and you're kind of up and down, no matter what else has gone on in your life, you're not going to physiologically be able to manage your world very well. So things like this start to build resilience. So you've got more buffer to manage what's being thrown at you.
Yeah, and in mitochondria, I mean, we're just beginning to learn about mitochondria disease, and it's just, I mean, if you look at the mitochondria are little organelles. They were originally in the eukaryotic cells. They were symbiotic bacteria, and over the years, and there's like 3,000, more than 3,000 genes that regulate mitochondria, and most of them are in your nuclear DNA, the main DNA of the cell. There's only like I think 37 genes left in the mitochondria. They have their own DNA, and they just make some key things, but the regulation of the mitochondria, like for instance, in the basically the glands that produce the hormones, the mitochondria make pregnenolone. They turn LDL cholesterol into pregnenolone, and that's the precursor molecule for pretty much all the hormones. And but also in every organ in the body, depending on how the whatever it is, the mitochondria will make special chemicals or other substances for the proper regulation of that body and of that organ or tissue. And it's really complicated, and that's why there's over like 3,000 mitochondrial diseases. But the key one is, if you just can't make the ATP, or there's any problem with your mitochondria, and usually what happens is the larger cell provides the antioxidants the mitochondria need to function, like SOD and catalase. And if those aren't there, then the mitochondria have to downregulate. They just can't produce as much. They're self-regulating, so they don't destroy themselves. So then you don't have enough energy. You have fermentation processes that go on, and it's just it can just become a real problem. And that's why C60 works so well. It gets to the base of the loss of those antioxidants, and then once the mitochondria can return to full function, then processes can heal themselves.
Hmm. And a lot of people need to remember too that antioxidants, like our oxidative load tends to increase as we age, and our antioxidants tend to decrease as we age. So depending on what we're doing and how we're living our lifestyle and you know what we're being exposed to, it's sort of an ongoing balance that you're trying to coordinate. So, trying to minimize exposure to certain things that are going to cause oxidative load. And then at the same point, doing the things that you can to try to mitigate that by increasing a antioxidant that's going to sort of quench a lot of that additional oxidative load on your body.
Yes, and that's yeah. There's just in today's modern world, there are so many more toxins and stresses than our ancestors had. So every bit helps.
Hmm. Well, and it ties me when we're talking about stress. The other one I wanted to talk about was sort of liver function specifically. I know even when I'm looking at things from a Chinese medicine perspective, there's a lot of people that would be diagnosed with something that we would call like a liver qi stagnation picture. And a lot of that happens from chronic stress, just lifestyle chronic stressors that go on and on and on. And so some of that's tied in with like lack of processing key emotions, but it also ties in with what we're eating and how we're not processing things. And how does C60 support liver detoxification pathways or liver function in general?
Is one of the key. It's the largest organ, I think, in the body, and probably the most key since it gets rid of all the toxins and lets if you don't process those toxins, your body will store it elsewhere. That's like a lot of people that have excessive weight gain. It's not because they're eating too much or it's hormonal. It's because the liver can't process those toxins, and then it's storing them in the fat until it can get around to someday doing that. And so that's why you get the sudden weight gain. It's not, it's to store up those toxins. Yeah, C60 in animals test studies, which are most of what they've done, they gave, for instance, they had one study where they gave they had the control rats which just got regular rat chow. And then they had another rats where they gave them, the regular rat chow and carbon tetrachloride, which is a really nasty chemical. And then the other set got carbon tetrachloride and C60. And when they did the sacrifice, they looked at the rats after the study, and there really was no physical damage in the liver for the rats who got the carbon tetrachloride with C60. And that's a just a nasty, and it's probably similar for other environmental toxins. So, and most environmental toxins, when they break down, they produce oxidative radicals, and it's those oxidative radicals that go out and cause the damage. Well, C60 neutralizes those oxidative radicals before they can do a cascade of damage in the liver and or elsewhere. And that's one of the key things. And also C60 likes to hang out in the liver before it goes out. It usually goes out to the gallbladder.
Hmm. Well, and that's an important point too. A lot of times people forget. So a lot of times people will do a liver detoxification protocol of some sort, but depending if all of the phases are supported properly, you can actually run into trouble. Some people do certain things that actually upregulate the first phase, which actually creates more damaging. Like you said, it actually is what creates a lot of these water soluble particles that actually are, I should say, it actually creates more oxidative load on the body, which then the second phase has to make water soluble so we can get rid of. And so a lot of times if people are just doing a upregulation and they don't know exactly what they're doing, I mean, sometimes that's why people don't feel better after they do a liver detoxification protocol of some sort. So I think that anything that starts to quench that free radical load decreases the load on the body. Now, one of the other things I think is important that ties in with liver, because sometimes people are thinking, liver, I think of it like maybe with digestion and some of these things and bile production, but how does that play in with hormones? Because this is something that I see a lot of times when I'm looking at, a lot of times I would say with women with estrogen dominance, but it can go beyond that. But how does the liver function directly relate with some of the imbalances that people can get with hormones?
Well, the liver is the main organ which takes the used up hormones out of the body. That's how you get rid of the excess estrogen. That's how you get rid of, testosterone, all the other hormone are, basically that are out there, the cortisol when it's been used up, other adrenalines. That's the liver's job, is to take those, break them down, and get them out of circulation in the body. And if your liver isn't working, then yeah, you can get estrogen dominance, or you can get just problems because those hormones, which are usually damaged, so they're causing other problems, jamming up channels, signaling channels. They need to be taken out of the body at a certain rate. And if that's not happening, you're in trouble. You have a real problem. And especially like in the thyroid and T3 and T4, and then they have deactivated types. So yeah, the liver is taking the hormones out of the body is incredibly key. And another thing I'm talking about liver, that's one of the reasons you need to eat a lot of fiber. Because when the liver will take these hormones and other toxins and they will stick things to it, basically fatty substances, and then they will push it out through the gallbladder. And then you need to have fiber so that those things will stick to that fiber so it goes out of your body. And if you don't have enough fiber, well, then they can get reabsorbed in the large intestine, and it's just back to the same thing. So you're not fixing it. So yeah, eating a lot of fiber, green leafy vegetables is probably the best way, is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I find a lot of times with liver stuff like that, especially if there's gallbladder issues and there's bile that's not being moved very quickly and it starts to stagnate, a lot of times that even goes higher up in the chain up to like stomach acid levels. If stomach acid is low, which happens a lot of times, people that have hypochlorhydria, right? Like low stomach acid, then that's kind of the first step on everything else starting to work properly. So you have to have a certain pH in the stomach, which then has to come down to the duodenum, has to have a certain pH. That's the stimulus to even release bile to come out and to do its job. So if some of that stuff is out of balance right from the get-go, it's almost like everything down the chain slows down. So again, back to like regular basics, eating healthy and stuff like that, you can assess. You can check to see where your pH is at in your stomach and fine tune that stuff as well.
Yeah. And I've also find intermittent fasting is, especially for older people, is almost one of the key things you need to do. And, I discovered it many years ago, but I had gotten a little bit of excess weight, and like we all do as I was getting older. And I'd done got rid of the 3 whites, did this, do that, right? All of these different things. And, none of them, you just take you down to a certain level, but until I did intermittent fasting. And basically, for people listening, intermittent fasting is you just eat in a food window. You have like, you only eat during 8 hours a day, and or maybe in a 6 hour one, you only work that. And now think about what the average person, let's all say the average American, but it's probably the same for anyone. They get up in the morning, let's say they eat breakfast at 7 o'clock, right? So you eat this breakfast, and then you go and maybe you have a snack or something. Then you have lunch, and then it's the afternoon, and maybe you eat a couple of things. Then you go home, it's late at night, maybe 6 or 7, you eat that. Then let's say you watch some TV and you have a snack eating it there. So you're eating at 9 or 10. Well, you start looking at that. Well, you just had your internal organs, your various pancreas, your small intestine, they were working like a 16, 17, sometimes 18-hour day. Now, if you physically worked an 18-hour day, you'd be exhausted. Well, the same thing happens for your internal organs. So when you do a intermittent fasting, let's say you have an 8-hour fast window or a 6 hour, when you just, you fast the rest of the day and you only eat during a 6 hour window, then your body has like an 18-hour time to rest up so that it can get. And I found that after I went to intermittent fasting, my internal digestive effectiveness increased greatly. It was just amazing. And it's not, and that's just a simple something that people can do. It's generally better for men. The women have to be a little bit more careful when doing intermittent fasting, but it can also be done. But it was such a benefit to me that I really encourage people to look into the whole thing about intermittent fasting. It'll really improve your health.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It's definitely a part of our regular routine. And it's one of those things where then when you can find certain strategies and add them in, it's like that's where you start to get these compounded effects. Intermittent fasting, I think, for the most part, is not too tricky for most people once you start. And there's not necessarily a ton more benefits to do like longer fasts compared to intermittent fasting. It's relatively the same. I mean, there's some other specifics, but for the most part, you can get away with, like you said, a 6 to 8 hour eating window and fast around that. And you get so many benefits. And I found too, like even from a diet perspective, when you're intermittent fasting, the way that your body even utilizes those calories within that window is different than if you spread those calories out throughout an entire day. So you can get away with more in some regards by condensing it in your window. So even like for people that aren't really prepared to make big changes in their diet, if you just first change the window that you eat them in, that alone starts to impact dramatically so many different things. To me, it's like, and it also gives your gut a big rest. If you think about it, and I remember reading this before when I started to get into intermittent fasting, and it would talk about what would it really have been like back when we were more of a hunter-gatherer society. I mean, you probably did not wake up in the morning and sit down and have a big breakfast. It just probably wasn't the way it worked. You'd probably get up and start foraging for food, and likely, you'd come down and then probably have more of a larger meal kind of midday to evening where you'd sort of hang out and sit down. And so I think that intermittent fasting is really a natural part of how we would likely have lived at some point in time. So when we get back there and we get that break, and some people just need a total break on their gut. It's like you said, they're pulling a 16, 18-hour shift sometimes, digesting all day long, and it's not designed to do that. I mean, there's a lot of energy that the gut uses. So if you can give that a total break at times, you've got a lot more energy for other things too.
Yes, and then one of the great things about intermittent fasting is it's not like dieting. During that window, you can eat what you want, you can be fully satisfied. And that means you don't get the slowdown in metabolism. When people crunch their, maybe it doesn't matter when they eat it, they crunch their number of calories down to nothing, then your metabolism slows down. And so you just defeated yourself. So
Yeah.
you don't get that back problem with intermittent fasting.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope when people go into calorie restriction. You'll usually lose weight for a little bit, and then you kind of find you're not, and then it gets really tricky to start to bring your calories back up in a healthy way. So, but yeah, I would try intermittent fasting. Women, again, like you said, sometimes it's a little bit different. You have to play a little bit with even the ratio of different fats and carbohydrates and proteins and stuff like that a little bit. And you might want to be aware of it depending on what your overall stress level is like before you engage in it. But again, like trust your body. Listen to how your body's feeling when you incorporate these things. Most of these things are pretty safe to experiment with and try. One thing too around liver function, when we were talking about estrogen, I think this is also a really important perspective, because a lot of times we're in a culture where we think something's out of balance, we need to take something else to fix it, and then we need to take something else to fix it. And So when we think about estrogen dominance, that essentially means that when you're looking at estrogen progesterone, there's generally more estrogen in relationship to progesterone. And then that starts to create these troubles. And so I think in from almost like what people conventionally think is, well, if I'm here, then I just need to take more of this. So I need to go get more progesterone and bring it back up. And sometimes that can be an okay thing, but is the problem actually that you're too low here, or is the problem that you got too much of this? And so my first instinct is always to how can you just naturally balance it so that this starts to come back down again and they regulate? So rather than just constantly adding more and more hormones to your system, can you just clean up the system and let it get back to self-regulating? I mean, the body is designed to know what it needs to do. It just sometimes needs some support. And then you might need something like that after. But my first part is like, get liver function working properly, see if it can clean out stuff a little bit better, and then see where that takes you.
Hmm. Yeah, it's I think what it is, and also a lot of that is you know, because fat cells, for instance, produce estrogen as well.
Mhm.
So controlling body weight is important as well, because and so it's just and also the big thing as we talked before, the liver cleaning that those used estrogens up, estradiol and the rest of them, that needs to be taken out. I mean, they're self-regulating, and if it isn't all working together, then that's usually what happens, and it just and it just it becomes liver health is really a key to good health.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, such a massive organ and plays into so many different, a lot of energy goes towards liver function. So you'll see that when liver's not working well, energy goes down, mood goes down. I mean, everything, digestive problems. I mean, it's a lot, it's a big picture. A lot of stuff clears up by just working on that one piece.
Mhm.
And the other one that I think is really important, and this is one that's even been studied a fair bit over the last while, is inflammation. So we know inflammation is a cornerstone for just about all disease. It ties very closely related to oxidative load on the body. But tell us a little bit about inflammation, and particularly how inflammation can even start to affect mood, even from a biochemical standpoint.
Yeah, well, if you look at inflammation, well, inflammation is basically caused by oxidative radicals, and then they go out. And there's two types. There's acute inflammation. Let's say you twist your ankle, right, or damage your knee. That's good. You know, the body, you've got a damage there. The body, you know, there's the macrophages rush in to repair the damage. They got the neutrophils. You get the swelling. You get the added heat, which allows it. You know, whether even it's an infection, also helps to fight the bacteria. And there's also things that happen with inflammation. Is it actually there's a pathway that suppresses dopamine production, which is sort of your motivation molecule. Dopamine's what gets you out of the bed in the morning to go live your life. And your body doesn't, if you've got acute inflammation, your body doesn't want you getting up and running around. So there's a process by which it shoves down that dopamine. So you just kind of want to lie around until, you know, the injury heals, and then you get up and go. But and that's perfectly good, and it's very important. But the problem is with chronic inflammation, and that's what people have a lot of here. A lot of it's from diet, environmental factors, and various, or sometimes injuries, other things that, you know, that doesn't get fixed. And so you have this chronic inflammation, and that also suppresses the dopamine production. And that's kind of one of the good things where C60 gets in there, because C60 gets in there and it'll stop the oxidative radicals, but it also helps support the immune system, because it'll get in those immune cells and it'll moderate the reaction. So did a study here in like in a 2007 study in the Journal of Immunology with mast cells and basophils, and C60 reduced the cytokine destruction, histamine, and prevented like the stress allergic response, apophylaxis. So it would prevent that from happening. You still had the functioning immune system, but it stopped the overregulation. And I think a lot of some of these immune systems are actually caused by mitochondrial dysfunction in the immune cells, which are probably actually happening throughout the body. And so when you're, so that let's say if your mitochondria aren't, if your immune cells aren't producing enough antioxidants, when you have the oxidative cascade, which is often used to release histamines, so then you get an over release of them. But if you have the proper oxidative pathways or antioxidants like SOD, so your mitochondria are working correctly in your immune cells, then they have what they need to operate correctly, and everything works much better. So we have a lot of people, that's why a lot of people, they take C60, say, whoa, I'm just motivated to go like start exercising again or go do another hobby again. Well, that's because there is some underlying chronic inflammation, which was suppressing dopamine production. And once you get rid of that through the variety of processes, then your dopamine levels go up and you want to go back and live your life again.
Hmm. Yeah, and again, it kind of like the estrogen and progesterone imbalance. It's like you're removing logs in the fire so that essentially you can let your dopamine production just naturally start to balance itself back out, as opposed to trying to directly push it, right? Trying to, sometimes you might take certain supplements to try and do that. That can still be okay at times, but the first step in my mind is always, can you just take the tension off the body and see what it can do naturally when you support it properly before trying to drive it by doing different things?
Yeah, that is important.
Now, the other thing too with chronic stress and chronic inflammation is how it specifically affects pregnenolone and how that sort of causes troubles. Can you maybe break that down a little bit too, the importance of pregnenolone and how that's impacted in states of chronic stress and chronic inflammation?
Well, they often use it as the pregnenolone steal, and what happens is, you only, like, especially in your adrenals, right? There's only so much in there, and exactly how it's getting. And so, let's say if you're under chronic stress, and you don't have so much pregnenolone production, then it goes to, making cortisol, rather making, let's say, an androgen or a mineral corticoid, which helps regulate blood. And so what happens is it all goes into cortisol or adrenaline or whatever it is, and there's not really enough left over to make the other hormones that you need to do all the other regulation. And a lot of that, there are just, if you have a bad relationship, which is incredibly stressful. I mean, that's one of the most, or even like a bad job,
Mhm.
these things can be just so incredibly stressful that that especially in today's modern world, the pregnenolone steal will just, and if you don't get your various other hormones, and it can go everywhere, right? You can get the pregnenolone drain is there, and one of the things is that pregnenolone is created by the mitochondria. So if the mitochondria don't have enough of the antioxidants they need to run, then they can't make enough, they can't convert it. And pregnenolone's made from LDL cholesterol. So that's the bad cholesterol. And that's why people have, the problem with the bad cholesterol isn't bad cholesterol. What it is, it's used to make important things for your body. What happens is if your body can't process that stuff, that LDL cholesterol hangs around in your bloodstream until it gets oxidized, damaged, and then it sticks to your arteries and causes that whole inflammatory response that causes plaques. So you need to make sure that your mitochondria are working so that they're processing that LDL out of your bloodstream into whatever, and then to whatever it is downstream. And the mitochondria make a whole lot of other things as well. It's really important for cell division and the making of DNA and RNA for cell division. It's really important.
The other thing that I find a lot of times that happens too is that when people have been under high stress for a long period of time and they're under that high inflammation. So I remember seeing, even for a period of time, I was working with a number of police officers that were part of this sort of intense unit where they would be doing stakeouts like all night, and then it would be like really high intense undercover kind of stuff, and so their stress would go way up. And I had a few of them coming in and their cortisol was all really high and their testosterone was all incredibly low. And so one of the things around this is that when you're in that stress state like that and you get that pregnenolone steal and it's going to cortisol, everything else starts to get downregulated. So I mean, I saw that so clearly. And not just for men, for women too, it's really important. But because we've got such higher amounts of testosterone in men, when that really drops, I mean, you will dramatically see, like, a lot of times people think it's got to be erectile dysfunction or something like that. It's like, that's not always the first one. The first one's like low mood, low motivation, low energy, low stamina, muscle aches and pains that start to show up. I mean, these are all things that dramatically lower your quality of life, and they're going to have a dramatic impact on just how much your enjoyment. So you start to see then anxiety and depression start to become sequelae to all of these other things going on. So getting that chronic stress, and I mean, God, that is a pandemic in its own, is the amount of chronic stress that people are under. And this last year and a half, I mean, that has been amplified huge. I would say almost like the vast majority of the population would be having some degree of this going on because of the chronic stress that they've been under for the last year and a half.
Yeah, that's true. And we really aren't designed for this chronic stress. I mean, most of our ancestors were farmers. You get up in the morning, go work in the fields and take care of the chickens. and come home, and our lives were pretty boring and mundane, but they weren't full of like massive stress like they are today.
Hmm. Yeah, it was like designed to be, I think, 10% in that fight or flight for when you really needed to, run away from that bear or hunt or whatever it was that you were going to be doing. And then 90% of the time in rest and digest. And I mean, those things have been completely swapped. And mostly it's because of how we, the stressors, the timelines, the rat race that people are in. I think that's the kind of stuff, and the mental thinking that's going on over and over again. That's the stuff that keeps us chronically in that cycle. So lots of stuff around that to work with from a mental emotional standpoint. But at the same point, these are things that you can do to start to support it physiologically. So, big picture, guys, when we're talking about mental health, when we're talking whether it's from trauma, whether it's in a state of chronic anxiety or depression or mood dysregulation or just long-term stress, it's multifactorial. So as much as all of this stuff is important around working with emotions, staying with sensation, metabolizing the neurochemistry of emotion, a lot of stuff that you're hearing some of the different experts talk about in this series, you can't forget the physiology of it as well. And I think of this sometimes like if someone was totally anemic, so maybe they're trying to do things like cognitive behavioral therapy, and they're trying to do mindfulness or meditation practices. All of those things are really valuable, but if they're so depleted in something that they can't even muster the energy to actually do that work, you have to sometimes work on the physiology first. So when I think about things like mitochondrial function, it's like sometimes people have very good intentions, but they literally can't get themselves to do the stuff that they need to do to really make some of those changes in their life. And when you start to support the physiology and the biochemistry, all of a sudden that gives them enough to now start to do the next stages around stuff.
Yes, and C60 can help you that supporting your mitochondrial function, because basically you got four main antioxidants. You got SOD, catalase, glutathione, and CoQ10. And you can only supplement with CoQ10, basically. You can do, and with the others, you can do, especially glutathione, you can do like the precursors and hope your cells assemble them. But C60 can do the job of all of those in the fact that it's dealing with the high energy oxidative radicals. It doesn't interfere with the signaling oxidative radicals, but it still doesn't replace. It just lifts the oxidative burden so your cells can work, but it still doesn't replace good nutrition, clean
Hmm.
water, enough sleep, exercise, staying away from like bad lifestyle choices, like drinking excessively or smoking excessively. All of those things. You mean if you want to take control of your health and get better health, you've got to really put time and effort into it. And you're going to really make this step, because if you just think that there's a cure-all that can come along and save you, no, there's no magic pills out there ever. It doesn't work that way in the real world.
I think that's a good lesson all around. Even I'd say what's kind of gone on over this whole last chunk of time. It's if anything, what we're showing is that we need to be in control of our own lives. We need to take on self responsibility, and so a lot of that is what are the things that are going to really help you to build your immunity, to build your overall health. So it's like you have to make certain choices if you want to live a life in a certain way. It comes back to us making certain choices. So proper diet, proper clean water, proper movement, proper lifestyle choices. Those are all fundamentals. Outside of that, then you try to fine tune things that are going to add that next layer of support and benefit in your life.
Yeah, and the other thing is build your family and build your community, build your friends. So many people have become disconnected, and you really need to get your social support net. I mean, we aren't really meant to live alone in that way and isolated. We're meant to live in extended families. That's the
Yeah.
way we've always lived throughout history. And so, yeah, you really need to build your families. Not everyone in your family is perfect, and that's what we all know. But you have friends, you have good people that you do get along in your family. So build those family relationships. And like that cousin or uncle or grandparent that hasn't heard from you, give them a call. Kind of make your social net strong, because that'll really help with your mental health and everything as well.
Yeah, I think that's such an important message for everybody at this point in time. And sometimes we need those reminders, right? I mean, sometimes you go through stuff and sometimes you need a strong reminder on how important those things are. And I know like what's happened too over this last while, we've actually created some really really amazing community in a way that was very different than we had before. I mean, even the online community that we've connected with and some of the people that we've even interviewed and stuff, I feel like we've created this entire family in a whole different way and support network that we can reach out to. So as much as we've been separated, in some ways, I think it's even strengthened some of the other types of relationships that we can create.
Yes, and that's really good, because I've seen a little bit of that forming here, because that's we're going to need more of that in the future. Is working together is how people make things the future go forward.
Yeah, well said. All right, everybody. So check out the link below or go to the website at inspirehealthpodcast.com. You can click the link on the top right corner. That will take you to the C60 Purple Power website and use the promo code Dr. Loken. That's all in capitals, DRLOKEN, and you'll get 15% off your order. So check it out and then let me know how it works for you, okay? Ken, thank you so much for everything. I appreciate your time and going through that all. And I think that's going to be really beneficial for a lot of people.
Glad to be on and hope to be seeing you again.
We will. Thank you very much.